Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm JC. Today's video is going to be my masterclass experience with NK Jemisin. This was requested and I was very excited to take this class. I wanted to see what I could get out of a masterclass that was tailored to a style or genre that I don't actually write in, because I do firmly believe that you can always take bits and pieces from any genre, even if you don't write in it, and find a way to apply it to you. Now, I don't write sci-fi. I don't typically read sci-fi. Granted, I watch sci-fi related things. I will be honest and say I have not read any of N.K. Jemisin's work. But even though I have not read her stories, I still wanted to see what I could take from her class and her lessons that she had to give. And I was a little surprised that I actually was able to take some things from some of the world building parts in specific, considering that I don't write sci-fi. But she did, in some of the lessons, she did say that it applies even if you are creating a fictional town. I'm surprised that was actually applicable to me, but yeah, I did enjoy her masterclass, and now I'm going to stop rambling and I will slide on over and let you enjoy Masterclass with N.K. Jemisin, Fantasy and Science Fiction Writing.
One of the things that I liked about science fiction and fantasy when I was younger was the fact that my parents had been giving me lots of books of African American history, trying to make sure that I understood where I had come from. But with science fiction and fantasy, I could figure out where I was going, and that's the thing that I really wanted to know. I think I was like any child who reads science fiction and fantasy, imagining myself going into space and doing cool space stuff. Books were the only way that I could see myself in space. And even then I had to really work at it, because the books weren't putting me there. It was only my imagination that would. When I began my career as a writer, people were upfront with me about how hard it would be. What I don't think people said to me is that if you are legit good, if you work and hone your craft, you will eventually break in because you're a good writer. If you aren't good yet, work hard, get better, and then keep trying, and you will eventually make it. Yes, you're going to doubt yourself. Yes, you're going to be afraid. Yes, you're going to struggle. Yes, it's hard, but it's worth it in the end.
The 2018 Hugo Award for Best Novel, N.K. Jemisin.
The stars came closer for all of us. The stars are ours. Thank you. I decided that I wanted to become a professional writer when I hit 30 and had a baby midlife crisis. Anybody that's older than 30 is laughing right now. I'm laughing at myself. The idea of a midlife crisis at 30 is hilarious. But anyway, I hit 30 and realized I was not happy with the direction of my life. And I'd been a voracious reader up to that point. I continued to be a voracious reader. I've been one my whole life. And I was reading books that weren't as good as the stuff that I was doing. Like I was writing stuff and realizing, you know, this is actually pretty good. And here's this published book that someone got paid actual real money for. And I can do that. I can be at least that good. So I just decided at that point that I wanted to try. If I can, through sharing my expertise, make another person's journey a little easier, or even if I can just sort of help them understand that what they're experiencing is not abnormal. It's just, this is how it is. If you are just beginning that journey, just kind of learning how to just plain old write sentences and things like that, you may not find this super useful yet. But if you have refined your writing to the point that, you're starting to look at other people's fiction and published novels, and you're like, well, I can do that. Or I can at least get close to that, or maybe I can do better than that. If you're now starting to feel like the next step is publication, this is for you. We'll be covering how to build a world pretty much from scratch, literally from the planet level on down to the people. We will talk about individual characters and how to develop characters that are interesting and complex, for which I'll be using my own techniques that are kind of derived from psychology and my own background as a psychologist. We'll be using examples of my own work to demonstrate ways to get across information, ways to explain character, ways to engage readers with the plot. At the end of the day, we are all members of a society, and we've all got to cope with that society's problems and ills and issues. The publishing world is literally just a microcosm of that. The literary world is literally just a microcosm of that. The same difficulties we have in finding good representation among characters, the same difficulties that we have in our day job workplaces, in being seen and heard if you are of whatever background, and being seen and heard and treated equally if you're from a marginalized background. Those same problems exist in publishing, in fiction, in the writing itself. And this is one of the reasons why you as an artist can help to change that by making sure that you do a better job of depicting the world within your books than has existed in the world around you. Even if you're able to only achieve, kind of moderate success as a writer, you got your voice out there. You got your story out there. You helped to change the profession by your existence. I'm N.K. Jemisin, and this is my Masterclass. You've already stepped away from our world a little bit, so don't be hesitant about really striding away. Get into world building and have fun with it. Go forth and create something new. If you're writing science fiction and fantasy, world building is kind of essential. It's one of the pieces that make science fiction and fantasy different from other genre fiction. So it's, in a lot of cases, you're going to be writing things that are set on Earth, which we call the first world, but sometimes you're going to be writing things at one remove from Earth, i.e. secondary world material. And you want your world to feel real. You want it to feel lived in. And then if it does feel real and lived in, then people are going to be able to pay attention to characters and plot, which hopefully is what you really want them to pay attention to, and the world will sort of fade into the background. If you're building a new world, you are able to sort of go into topics and materials that can be a little uncomfortable for readers to engage with when they're set in the real world. We have personal feelings attached to all of the politics of our world. And politics is anything having to do with people. So, even if you don't think that you're talking about the politics, you are, if you've got a story that has people in it, you are talking about politics. If you're writing a story set in the real world, you may want to sort of use those brush strokes of emotion and deliberately evoke something that your audience is trying to kind of meet you halfway on. But if you're writing something set in another world, and you want people to engage just with the ideas or just with the characters in that setting, then you take them away from the real world on purpose. You're doing that as a means of detaching your reader from their own personal experiences to some degree. Now, because you're telling a story about people, and because stories about people always evoke some sort of emotion, you're still going to get a little bit of that in there, but not as much. And in a way, it's sort of a imagination cleanser, and that way you can draw people into ideas or allegories for the real world that take them away from their own personal experiences as much. The world builder is someone who's going to understand that world as if they live in it. The reader doesn't have to understand it on that level, but you need to understand it enough to not kick the reader out. When I first started learning different methods of world building, what I was told by many different people in the science fiction field was that it should be sort of like an iceberg. 90% of it is not visible, it's below the water. 10% of it is all you kind of really put into the work. The problem with that analogy is, first and foremost, you may need more than 10%. Second, the work that you put into the story that's not sort of immediately visible is still helping to support that other 10%. It's important. And suggesting that it's something that you are going to discard or is unseen implies that it's not important. It also implies that it's sort of scary. I mean, icebergs sink ships, and it's usually the part that you can't see. And so that's sort of an ominous way of framing world building as far as I'm concerned. That stuff is what makes the 10% work. You can't have those 10% pieces visible if you haven't put in a lot of effort to make the other 90% kind of look just as good.
Okay, so the first lesson is really just N.K. Jemisin introducing herself, telling you who she is, her background, how she got into writing science fiction, about her books, and what she plans on imparting on us throughout the class. Number 2 is the elements of world building. She says, with the world building, what you want to do, because we're specifically obviously talking about science fiction, is to take your readers away from the real world, but still implementing realism into the world that you're building so that it's not too far away from reality. And she says in the world building, you need to acclimate your readers to the day-to-day aspects of the world that you've created. How does this world work? The systems, the atmosphere, the culture, and the way that things are done, the traditions maybe of the world that you've created. So if you're creating a world that is in a time that no longer exists, you need to research that time period so that you can get some type of accuracy, because while it is fiction and you are creating a world that doesn't really exist, there has to be some semblance of realism there to connect the reader. She says one of the common mistakes that people make in world building is being lazy, and she references back to the iceberg theory about you only see the tip of the iceberg, so you don't have to really concern yourself with what's underneath. But in terms of research, especially in science fiction, you really need to be concerned about the 90% of research that people aren't really going to see. Yes, they're not going to see it, but it still influences and impacts the way that you write this world and this story, which thus influences the experience of the reader. Next lesson.
As you're creating this world that your readers understand, then you're able to create a world that feels more plausible. I break world building down into macro world building and micro world building. Macro world building is the creation of the physical environment in which this culture developed, these characters emerged from, this story takes place. So that can be everything from the creation of the universe on down, the laws of physics on down, because we're dealing with fantasy and science fiction here. Or it could, even people who are writing stories set in the real world do a little bit of macro world building. Even if a story is set in New York, you need to decide which piece of New York, which block of New York, which neighborhood of New York, and so forth. So with macro world building, I normally will start with the creation of the planet. and then we'll work down from there. We go to continents, we go to environments, and then we start to create people who fit into these environments. With world building, we aren't always stuck with planets. We can start at the level of the universe. If you want to write a story about space wandering clouds of people that don't have a planet, go for what you know, but you're going to have to research that. But in general, because your audience is familiar with life on a planet, and you want to try and probably sell them on life on a different planet, it's best if you start with something that's relatively familiar, like a terrestrial Earth-like world. Differences are observable in every species on our planet. The question becomes whether our culture ascribes any meaning to those differences. Micro world building is where we begin the process of actually creating the people who will populate this world. We create the culture, we create the power dynamics, and then we can go from there on creating a character. So with macro world building, you started with the planet, and with micro world building, you also started the sort of the most macro scale, which is the development of the species. You can decide whether you want to deal with humans or non-humans, because I just want to make it clear that even small changes in the way that these humans interact with their world is going to create a wildly different culture from anything that you've ever seen on this planet. So we'll start with species. The human species, we kind of know what humans are like. We're still figuring out things about ourselves, but for the most part, we pretty much understand how the human species operates. There's no reason why you can't tweak that a little bit, though, because the morphology of the human species, the ways in which our bodies work and are developed, are constantly changing with time, i.e. evolution, and are constantly changing in response to our environment as we try to adapt to the things that change around us. Then we start getting into the more subtle breakdowns of humanity. We can get into raciation. In our own planet, for example, one of the morphological changes that we've developed to respond to our environment is that we've developed different skin coloration based on the amount of UV exposure that we've got. People who are from cultures that developed at the equator, where they get a lot more sunlight or a lot more intense sunlight, tend to have darker skin so that they are more protected against UV rays. Whereas people who developed in cultures further from the equator, in closer to polar regions and things like that, developed lighter skin because they needed to get more light through their skin in order to develop vitamin D. So, that's an example of a non-significant difference. We're still the same species. We can still have children together. There's absolutely no real difference between lighter-skinned and darker-skinned people. These differences are observable in every species on our planet. We see melanistic jaguars and jaguars with rosettes. We see elephants come in different colorations, in different head shapes, and so forth. These are natural differences that exist just simply because of evolution. The question becomes whether our culture ascribes any meaning to those differences. And then we're starting to get into what we call acculturation. That's where the culture begins to decide whether these minor, insignificant differences between the ways that our species develops are important or not. So one of the things that you need to decide at this point is, how is your human species constructed? Are they the same as in our world, or are they wildly different from in our world? And what values do the people in this world ascribe to those differences? You also have to consider the fact that these differences are essentially arbitrary, and the meanings that we choose to ascribe to them are essentially arbitrary. So you need to decide whether the people in your world are going to ascribe any kind of value to the normal minor differences that exist in our species.
So in lesson 3 and 4, she talks about first macro world building in lesson 3, and Macro world building is when you create the physical environment of the world and the story that you're in. Um, the whether it's a grassy area or snowy, or the atmosphere, the environment that it's in. And in lesson 4, she talks more about the micro world building, which is the culture and the people of the world that you're creating. Um, as far as the macro world, the macro is like when you're creating the planet or the continent, if you're doing that type of science fiction. Or she even used an example for those who, like me, do not write science fiction, which is how I could relate to it. Um, because you may be creating a fiction, even if you're not writing science fiction, you may be creating a fictional town that doesn't exist, or it exists within an actual state, but the town doesn't actually exist. So you still have to create and build up this town and create buildings and streets and restaurants and names of things, create the environment of the town. Um, when she gets into micro world building in lesson 4, it's more about the development of species, the way the species or the people in the world that you are building interact with one another, their cultures, mannerisms, their habits, if they have a religious background to their culture, if they don't have a religious background to their culture, if they're not religious at all, that it's all the things that envelop the culture of the people that are in the world that you are creating. It's the structure of the humanity. It's essentially you discovering how the people within the planets or fictional town that you have created work. It's the best way I can sum it up. Next lesson.
You want to start asking yourself a series of questions. How would powerful people act in the society? How would less powerful people act in the society? These things will affect the character that you ultimately decide to tell the story through. Human beings are impossible to kind of define through a single sentence or a single piece of sociological detail. You want to segue from kind of making decisions or jotting things down. You want to start asking yourself a series of questions. So a typical example would be, what are the roles held by people in this society? What are the punishments for people who transgress those roles? What are the ways in which people use these roles to determine how to treat one another? And what are the rewards for good performance of those roles? Who's got power in the society? Who is trying to maintain their power, and who feels threatened by anyone that steps outside of their role? Start asking yourself these questions about how would powerful people act in the society? How would less powerful people act in the society? And then when you are about to decide who's going to be your viewpoint character for this story, ask yourself, who is the person that has the greatest ability to accomplish the goals of your story in this society, and who's the person for whom it is the least likely that they'll be able to accomplish their goals? And which would be the more interesting story to tell? The person who has power, who then goes forth to make changes in the world, or the person who is effectively powerless, who then goes forth to do the same thing? I tend to lean towards the latter, but lots of people can go different directions on that.
In lesson 5, we're getting more in depth with the micro world building power dynamics. When you're creating a town, fictional town, or fictional world, or planet, or continents, there are, aside from, the culture of people or whatever, there are power dynamics that exist between, people like, in the United States, we have the middle class, lower class, upper class. There are power dynamics and how they interact with one another, how one power dynamic affects another. But she also points out to beware of assuming assuming different biases. We all have our own biases. And to assume that a specific power dynamic or a specific culture of people are going to necessarily react or act one way when you're writing, don't make assumptions. It's essentially what she said. She talked a lot about at the end of this lesson about hiring sensitivity readers, being respectful of the culture that you're writing about. If you're writing about a culture that already exists and not creating your own culture of people, be respectful of that culture, i.e., getting sensitivity readers, and avoiding inappropriate culture appropriation. Yeah, next lesson.
The truth of the matter, though, is that what the audience believes is what matters. It's not our world. It's not our reality. It's not our time. And there's a lot of different ways that you can convey that. There's a common perception out there that science fiction is purely science and that fantasy is purely magic and historical. The truth of the matter, though, is that what the audience believes is what matters. And the audience's range of what they're willing to accept in each area is not as discrete as that. You know, at the end of the day, it's all just sort of speculative stuff. It's not our world. It's not our reality. It's not our time. And there's a lot of different ways that you can convey that. So if you're trying to sell your readers on magic that is indistinguishable from science, then you need to treat your magic like science. You have to talk about it having replicable effects, being measurable, things like that. Personally, I have a kind of general distaste for that. A lot of fantasy readers and a lot of fantasy fans have kind of been trained over the years by like D&D and other tabletop role-playing games that magic and all of these other things can be systematized, can be treated like just a standard thing that happens. You lose your hit points, you move on. Magic, I feel, should be a little more imaginary and a little more numinous than that. And you can take it in a lot of different directions if you don't feel constrained by the rules of some game system. At the end of the day, your job is to write fiction, not another textbook, so you don't need to let go and give yourself a PhD to plausibly depict this stuff. But plausibility has a kind of wide range. Of course, if you do have actual scientists read your work, they're going to react badly to anything that you get really wrong. And I do think it's important to try and make sure that you get the basics right. A lot of people learn about the world and learn about science from fiction. The goal is plausibility. You want to make sure that you've gotten enough of the basics right that you're not kind of doing anything really horribly or egregiously wrong, but you don't need to get bogged down in the details and the minutiae, and you also need to stay true to your world. The most useful thing that any artist can do to make themselves a better artist is to simply be open to the world around them. Experience as much as you can in every opportunity that you can. What I've kind of learned about art from my father, from other artists that I kind of grew up around, is that it is on the artist to experience as many things as they can so that they can accurately render the world. The artist's job is to speak truth, sometimes to power, sometimes just to reality. But your job is to speak the truth about the world as you see it. Now, obviously, you're a human being. You're going to filter things through your own perception. That's unavoidable. But you want to speak that truth honestly. Otherwise, you want to try and make sure that you're not letting stereotypes or shorthand thinking interfere with your ability to absorb the world. That is your job as an artist, is to perceive and interpret. Research and world building is probably my favorite part. So I'm going to try really hard not to get like super giddy and excited when I talk about it, but I'm probably going to do that anyway. Research is the thing that you're going to do to try and make sure that your fiction is as plausible and accurate as you can make it. If it's set in a real world place, then you should try and visit that place. If it's based on realistic people or real world people, you either need to read some books about those people or research their history or both, or talk to them. But if it involves travel, that's when it gets fun. The most useful thing that any artist can do to make themselves a better artist is to simply be open to the world around them. Try not to make assumptions. Try not to form hypotheses or presuppositions about anything that you're encountering. When you meet another person, try not to make any kind of judgments about them based on how they look or act or whatever. Try to just simply talk to them and get to know them and genuinely listen to them. If you are traveling into any space, even in your own neighborhood, walk around at some point and try and look at your neighborhood the way that a total stranger would. And just sort of pay attention to what you see. You do have to remember that because you're not writing a textbook, you can't go overboard with the research. You have to do something to kind of keep yourself from either spending too much time on it or getting too immersed in it and bogging yourself down in research as opposed to writing. So what I like to do is put a time limit on it.
Lesson 7, she talks about researching in terms of world building, and mostly she stresses that you do a thorough amount of research. Maybe take a month, take 2 months. If you can visit and travel to a place that you are writing about, or a place in the vicinity of something you're writing about, then it is worth the time and expense to go and do the traveling and research it that way so you can get a feel for the place. She also talks about while you should immerse yourself in the research for the purposes of accuracy, you don't want to go overboard and research so much that you get lost and you end up not writing a book. That is the gist of it. Next lesson.
Create a story that engages your reader as if they are part of that world, or create a story that reminds the reader that they are just observing the world through a window. Let's visualize immersion as a pyramid. Let's think about the fact that when you're creating a secondary world, when you're creating a world that your reader has got to learn to get into, you have to decide how you want to convey this amount of information to them. You can just give them a giant info dump at the very beginning of the book. That was very traditional in science fiction for many years. If you read a lot of older science fiction, you'll see that it starts with a prologue where they just drop a whole bunch of information on you. That's a form of immersion, but it's not, it's not really in style anymore. But you've got some choices. You can create a story that engages your reader as if they are part of that world, or you can create a story that reminds the reader that they are just a reader observing the world through a window. And I think of the latter as lower immersion, and the former, where you're immersed in that world as if you're a part of it, as high immersion. And then there's also a kind of in-between of moderate immersion. Low immersion stories can be third-person omniscient, which was very popular again for a while. Third-person omniscient is, he walked to the store and he was thinking about a bunch of different things as he did so. You know the character's thoughts and actions. The narrator is telling you everything that's going on with this person, and they're telling it to you as if they are telling a story, and it reminds you that you are the reader sitting at one remove from the book. With the moderate immersion stories, in a lot of cases, that's going to be third person but more limited. You're not going to know what's going on in the character's head unless you're specifically in that character's narration. And while that character is talking to other characters around them, you won't know what's going on in those other characters' heads, because the person who's the viewpoint character doesn't know what's in their heads. You can know what they see. That character can interpret what other people's facial expressions might mean, but they might be wrong. And so you are at that point kind of limited to only what that one viewpoint character at a time is able to tell you. In a high immersion story, you're going through that story, you're going through that character's life as if you are that character. That's often in first person. Sometimes you see it in extremely tight third person. Second person is a way to get deep into the character's mind, intentions, motivations, and so forth. It's not omniscient. You're not being told what's going on. You're literally experiencing it as the character is doing so. I hate the show don't tell. The idea of show don't tell is great for beginning writers. All of these rules that you hear about that are the rules of good writing are excellent for beginning writers, because beginning writers need to know where their parameters are. They need to know how far they can go. And they tend to overdo it until they get a better sense of what is realistic, or what is normal, or what is their own style, what works for them. And then once they've got that, then they can kind of start to discard some of those basic rules. And when you are doing world building, when you are talking about a setting that isn't Earth, sometimes you do just have to explain things. Sometimes you do just have to tell. You can learn by observing people, by understanding people. You need to understand the limitations of your own understanding of people if you're going to convey people right. So now that you have created a physical world, and you've created a culture to populate that world, and you've decided within this culture what kind of person would be the most interesting person to center on for storytelling purposes, someone powerful, someone not, someone who's at the center of the society or someone at its margins. Now that you've decided kind of what kind of person will exist in this kind of world, now you actually need to narrow it down and decide who your viewpoint character is going to be. Now this will not necessarily be your only character, and they will not necessarily be your protagonist. Viewpoint character and protagonist are two completely different things. They can be the same, but they don't have to be. Some older science fiction novels tended to have not great characterization, because in a lot of cases those novels were written by people who didn't know very much about people. And the values of science fiction back in the Golden and Silver Age were that you centered on getting the science right. It was important to make sure that you got the science right. And not so much with the people. It's no longer acceptable to have spot-on science, but characters that read like, cartoons. Now it's important that you have characters that feel real. I think it's absolutely crucial that science fiction and fantasy writers understand the humanities. You don't have to go to school for them. You don't have to major in English or history or any of those social sciences. You do have to understand them, though, and you do have to respect them as sciences just as important as natural sciences or physical sciences. And if you don't know people, you can learn by observing people, by understanding people, by making sure that your preconceptions of people aren't coming from something shallow or false like stereotypes. Making sure that you actually have tried to engage with the complexity of people. People are three-dimensional. People are contradictory. People don't always behave in ways that television or media suggests that they behave. Another really important thing, though, and I touched on this briefly before, but another really important thing that writers should do is read. Read books from people from different backgrounds. Read books written by people from those backgrounds. Read books that are about those other cultures and other parts of the world. Anthropological books and things like that. History books that are complex and that ask questions and don't just present propaganda to you. You need to understand the limitations of your own understanding of people if you're going to convey people right. If you were creating a character, iceberg theory doesn't really apply because every part of a person's background and personality is immediately and visibly relevant to how they present themselves over the course of a story. You don't necessarily, they're not necessarily going to, kind of spend a lot of time talking about their childhood, but their childhood has an impact on the adult that they have become. And you, as the author, need to be aware of that.
Lesson number 9 talks about the psychology of characters and drawing inspiration for characters from dreams, experiences, and psychology. Um, she talks about understanding the humanities and the background of your character, what makes your character tick, what makes them act the way they do, respond to things the way that they do, and that you don't, when you're developing the psychological background of your character, um, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to impart all of that psychological background to your reader, but knowing it as the writer helps to inform your writing of that character and to better for you as the writer to know where that character is coming from and the place that they're coming from when they're acting in a certain manner that to the reader seems unfathomable or just they don't understand, but you as the writer understand because you know their background, their traumatized childhood, or whatever their background may be. Next lesson.
Ask yourself what you would know about a person after 30 seconds in an elevator with them. You can observe what they look like. You see how they're dressed. Do they speak briefly? Do they speak in a comfortable way? Are they comfortable with you? All of these things feed into your outer life perception of that person. In my character model, we start with the very basics about a person. Their demographics, their age, their race, their gender, all of the very simple things that, either you can maybe glance at a person and know, or a writer can just do a one-line description and you'll know all about it. Then we start to move into things that are a little less visible. The things that you can observe about a person if you know them relatively well, and you can at least sort of guesstimate what their background is the person's outer life. You can guess by looking at a person's clothing, or how they present themselves, or by listening to their accent. You can figure out what their class or background might be in a lot of cases. That's what those role performances are about that we talked about in the world building section. Now that you have thought out the world that this person is coming from, the culture that this person is coming from, you've figured out what kind of person you want to center the story on, someone who's, you figured out their basic power dynamics. Now I want you to pause for a moment and just think about the basic demographics of the kind of person that you want to write about. Is this person, what is their gender? What is their race? What is their age? And this is per the world that you've developed so far. Identity is a subset of demographics. Demographics just talks about the characteristics of that person and nothing more. Identity is the characteristics of that person and what those mean. If you're going to explore a character's identity, you need to understand how identity works in our own world. And think about the ways in which we granularize human beings. You can at least assess, how is that person talking? What's their accent? What language are they speaking? Does it sound like they speak multiple languages? All of these things feed into your outer life perception of that person. So imagine yourself in an elevator with your character, your proposed character, for 30 seconds. You're going down to the first floor. You got 30 seconds to figure out everything you can about them. Write that sentence down. We instinctively feel more connection with a person who we see going through this process of trying to decide who they want to be and then making that decision and then going forward. We like to root for an underdog. When you're trying to create a new story, or when you're trying to create the plot of a story, you've probably heard people refer to a typical 3-part plot arc. That's just basically a beginning, a middle, and an end. You start off with the character in a basic state. You carry the characters through a period of rising action. You hit a climax. Usually that's where there's a big fight or something that happens. Then there's a period of falling action, and then maybe you have a coda or a resolution thereafter. And a typical character arc follows a similar format. A character plot arc can take both the internal and external form. We're going to talk first about the externally driven character arc. Now that also comes in 3 stages, a beginning, a middle, and an end. What I use as terminology for this is the character is first in a steady state. It can be a kind of complacent state where they feel comfortable or just going about their daily lives, their day-to-day commute, whatever. Then there's an inciting incident, something that impacts them on a huge level. Inciting incidents can take a lot of different forms, and not all readers are going to be interested in all inciting incidents. This is why when you do see an externally driven character arc, usually it's kind of important to spend some time establishing that this character is interesting and worth following, worth caring about. So it's a good idea with an externally driven character arc to actually start in that steady state with the character, because then you have time to explore the person's character, make them someone that the audience will empathize with, and then when this terrible thing happens, then we care what happens to them. Typical identity development theory and identity development models originated with Black racial identity development, so this gives you kind of an idea of what we're working with. Begin with a sort of steady state of complacency. So I decided to use a variation of this identity development model, where a character who is in a steady state basically encounters something that forces them to rebuild who they are as a person and decide on a new path for themselves. This is the basis of the internally driven character arc.
Okay, lesson number 11 and 12. I think 11, 12. Yeah. Kind of wrap up together because it's both talking about the hierarchy of characterization. In lesson 11, it's more about the demographics in the outer and inner life. And she says you want to start with the demographics, gender, race, age, that sort of thing. And then you move on to understanding how the identity works, the characteristics and what they need or what they mean. You come up with their outer life, the things that you observe from the outside looking in, and conveying their outer life to the readers. Lesson 12, she gets more into the pyramid when she starts talking about the external driven arc and the internal driven arc. The arc of the character itself, not the arc of the story. She talks about how, you know, just as the overall novel or the overall story has an arc, beginning, middle, end, the character should have an arc, beginning, middle, and end. No character should be in the same place at the end as they were in the beginning. Um, she talks about how we're obligated to introduce marginalized characters to your readers. You've been given this space, this time, this platform to write and to change the world with your writing, so you should use it to introduce um, characters that don't always get depicted, or at least maybe don't always get depicted in the right light to your readers, specifically if you are a marginalized person or marginalized writer yourself. Um, yeah, next lesson.
There are people out there who need your example. If your book is out there, your voice is out there, your face is out there, you're contributing literally just by existing. You are not just writing for yourself anymore. Let's be blunt here. The publishing industry is no different from any other major institution in American society, or English-speaking language society, because it's very similar in other countries. It has a huge problem with systemic and endemic racism, sexism, a bunch of other isms. And the bulk of the power players are cishet white guys. The editors, for the most part, are cishet white women. But the people actually making decisions at the CEO level or the publisher and up level tend to be men. So depending on how far you choose to make your text veer from what their preferences are, because, you know, it has to be said that there are a lot of marginalized people throughout the history of literature in this country who've concealed their problematic identities and gone on to publish fiction, you know, where they just don't mention what people look like, or they just don't mention those aspects of people's lives. And so it's certainly possible to publish books that are of meaning and value to the people who are decision makers, whether you yourself come from a marginalized background or not. People who come from marginalized backgrounds all know how to speak the language of the center. We all have read all of the books with the white guys in them. We know what kinds of stories are popular with that audience. Everybody knows that. That's what makes them the center. The thing that is relevant, or the thing that you do have to kind of keep in mind as you're writing, if you choose to conceal your identity and sort of just go with the flow, basically, is that, you know, you're effectively participating in your own marginalization. You're participating in that bigotry. You're complicit with it, and that's not necessarily a state that everybody wants to be in. You have to choose your battles. You have to choose which one of those battles you're willing to fight and die on a hill for. You know, some authors have had to accept completely inaccurate, racist or otherwise bigoted cover art because the alternative was their voice did not get out there, their stories did not get written. One of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors, Dawn by Octavia Butler. When I first encountered this book back in the 80s when she first started getting published, the book cover had an image of a white woman pulling another white woman out of some kind of weird alien plant, When you actually read the book, though, the protagonist of that story, the person who pulled the white woman out of the alien plant, was herself a tall black woman with an Igbo name. And so this is what she had to deal with in order to break in. If she hadn't existed in the industry, if her voice had not been out there, if her example and trailblazing had not happened, I might not be able to have a career even now. Because one of the reasons I chose to start trying to get published was because I knew Butler had had a thriving career in this business. But in order to have that thriving career, she had to swallow whitewashing on her book cover. You've got to decide how many of these battles are worth fighting and how hard you're willing to fight. But you do have to fight. I think it's absolutely crucial that if you are on the brink of becoming a published author, and you get the opportunity to become a published author, you need to understand that you are not just writing for yourself anymore. There are people out there who need your example, who need you to go forth and fight that battle so they won't have to fight as hard. And it's worth it to fight that battle so that they won't have to fight as hard. Because, if anybody sort of paved that way for you and made things a little easier for you, you kind of have an obligation to pay that forward. And understand that even if you feel like you've lost a battle, if your book is out there, your voice is out there, your face is out there, you're still helping. You're contributing literally just by existing. And if you can manage to do more than exist, if you can not just survive but thrive, then you may end up changing the industry, ultimately. The reason to keep fighting is so that things can get better. And it's a constant drain. It's a constant war. It's a war that you know will not end in your lifetime. And you're going to get tired of fighting at various points. You're going to need to find ways to recharge from that fight at various points. If you need to stop trying to get published for a while, take a break, breathe, and kind of remind yourself of what's important to you, then do that, but come back. Because at the end of the day, your struggle and your sacrifice makes someone else's life that much easier in the future. And, I'm blunt about the fact that I would not be here if Octavia Butler had not dealt with all the crap that she had. I don't write anything like her. I'm not really trying to be her or anything like that. But just the fact that she, as a tall, heavy-set, deep-voiced, dark-skinned black woman, was able to walk into this incredibly white establishment that is, science fiction's sort of upper echelon. And she blew it out of the water. She did an amazing job with her work. Her writing leaves a mark and changes anyone who reads it, of whatever background. She changed the industry by being here. I do not aspire to have that same impact. Whether I do or not will depend on my work. I leave that to history to decide. But I am aware of the fact that just by striving, other people will be inspired to do it too. And, together we rise.
So there you have it. My masterclass experience with N.K. Jemisin. I think this class would be highly, highly beneficial for someone who writes in science fiction and fantasy. So it's definitely worth you taking the class. And yeah. So that's going to be it for this video. If you like what you see and you want to see more videos from me, make sure that you hit the like and subscribe button. Let me know in the comments. Once again, what masterclass would you like to see me take next? As usual, if you would like to support me in any of my creative endeavors, such as my blog site, my magazine site, my online store, or my Ko-fi page. All of those links can be found in the description box below. Until next time, have a blessed day. Bye.